I'm Rob Skinner, and this is the Rob Skinner Podcast. Today, I'm interviewing Dr. Sean St. Jean. I ran into Dr. Sean St. Jean at the Climb Conference in December of 2023, where he did about a 10-minute presentation on his new book, which is called Spiritual Trauma. And it's a fantastic book. It's called A Guide for Healing Your Heart from Church Hurts. Now, I just read this book, and so I thought, I got to talk to him. I got to really dig in there and find out what he's teaching and ask him some questions about the material in there, because I was definitely challenged on a personal level by a number of things he said. So stick around and listen to Dr. Sean St. Jean talk about his book, Spiritual Trauma. All this and more on the Rob Skinner Podcast. Welcome back to the Rob Skinner Podcast. My goal is to inspire you to live a no-regrets life, make this life count, and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. As I said at the intro, I am so fired up to talk to Dr. Sean St. Jean. He's in my studio here today, and we met for the first time just about 5 months ago, but it's been a really, really great. I just feel like God made our paths cross, and so I look forward to talking to him. And I'm also excited because this is actually my first live video podcast. And I went to a podcasting conference recently, and I thought, I need to update my skills. That's why I went to the conference. And so I went to the conference, and I came away going, from now on, I got to really try to get this video going and put it on YouTube, and so more people can watch it and listen to it. So you are getting the benefit of this new breakthrough technology in the video podcast. So I thought no better person to experiment with than Sean St. Jean. So, Dr. Sean, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. I wish you could have had a prettier man for your first video podcast, but I guess I'll do.
I think you're doing great. I think you're just doing perfect. Well, let's get right into it. How did you become a Christian?
I became a Christian back in 1996 in Vancouver, Canada. I had been an atheist. My dad was an atheist. His dad was an atheist. So I came from a long line of people that didn't really believe in God. But I remember standing on a hill looking over the University of Victoria in BC, and just longing for God. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was actually praying to God. I was just saying, God, what do you want? And how do I find you? And it was that year that somebody who I'd gone to high school with, he had become a disciple, and he reached out to me, and I didn't look back. I mean, I remember my first Bible study being kind of prideful. Like, I remember saying to the guy studying with me, well, the Bible's so full of contradictions, and I don't know why I should believe that. And he's like, "Oh, can you find me a contradiction? I'd love to see one." And I was like, "Oh, well, I mean, I don't know exactly where I mean, I know they're in there." And he said, "I'll tell you what, John, you find me one contradiction in the Bible, and I'll stop being a Christian today." And I was like, "Oh, okay, all right." So that humbled me out a little bit.
What a great challenge.
Yeah.
So what year was that again?
1996.
1996. Okay, Vancouver, British Columbia. Were you going to, is it BCU? British Columbia University? No?
UBC, University of British Columbia.
Okay.
It's kind of the big school there. Yeah, I wasn't at UBC. I was actually at an art school called Emily Carr, taking art courses.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Well, how'd you meet your wife?
Yes, that's a very long story, but I'll tell you, I was on a mission team to Edmonton, Alberta in 2001, and around 2003, I became sort of disillusioned. And I remember I was at a wedding. I was at a cousin's wedding in a little town in the middle of the interior of BC called Vernon. And I'd never been there before. And I remember leaving the party, the wedding reception, and walking down to the lake. And I was praying. And I remember I was in tears. I was praying for God to bring me a wife because I just felt so lonely. And I remember it like it was yesterday because it was a really hot evening and I was looking across the lake to these kind of sparkling lights on the hill across the lake there. And what I didn't realize is that as I was praying to God to give me a wife, I was looking at the hill my wife grew up on. I was looking at her house. So, can you believe it?
It's awesome. A lot of connections there.
Yeah, like I'm not like a woo-woo kind of guy.
Right.
But that's a woo-woo kind of story. I mean,
that's
a God
that is
moment.
a cool story. Well, there's another connection there with Vernon because we have a friend in common. Vernon, I mean, I've never been to Vernon. I know it's out in Timbuktu, but there was a great guy that I studied the Bible with back in Japan. His name is Andy Overend. He married a woman named Melanie, and he's from Vernon, Canada. So that's really what sparked our conversation back in December. Like, hey, I mean, I just said, hey, do you know Andy Overend? And he's like, and then you said you did. I was kind of blown away, to be honest.
Yeah, he's one of my best friends to this day.
That's crazy. That's crazy. And he's still in Vernon?
He is. Yeah, he's on a little farm. He bought a farm from his dad like some years ago, and he's raising all kinds of animals. And yeah, it's great. He works at a local Christian school there.
Andy, if you're listening to this, I just want to say all the best to you and Melanie. I've got so many great memories of being in Hamadayama with you. I know you were teaching English back at the time. Our kids, like David, James, and all still consider you one of the funniest men of all time. When we would go to Japanese baseball games together, you were incredible with kids and with people. So yeah.
He still is. He's one of the funniest guys I know. And I'm super grateful for him. And nobody did more to help me write this book, the spiritual trauma book, than Andy. He went through it line by line, and we spent hours talking through the material. So super
that's
grateful
awesome.
for him.
That's awesome. Okay, so what's your wife's name? When did you guys get married?
Erin. Yeah, her name's Erin. We were married in 2004.
Okay.
So it's 20 years this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's great. Now, in reading your book, I got about 3/4 of the way through, and you talk about a massive bicycling accident you had about 20 years ago. Yeah. I guess that must have been right around the time you got married, before or after. Can you tell me about that, and how did it affect who you are now and what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was part of the campus ministry for the better part of a decade. I was there to make disciples, study the Bible with lots of people, didn't have a degree to show for it at the end. Because, frankly, I wasn't there to get a degree. I was only there
just
to
preach
make
the
disciples.
Word. Of course. Right.
So, fast forward a few years. I'm newly married. I've got a baby son, my baby Noah, and I'm working for basically minimum wage, driving a produce truck. And I was cycling to work one day, and it was right during sunrise, like that dawn period. Didn't have reflectors on, didn't have a light, and a construction vehicle backed up right in front of me, and I went over my handlebars, flew about 30 feet in the air, and landed face first on the asphalt. I was out for 9 minutes, woke up to see my teeth laying in front of me. Yeah, it was, I mean, I had a really bad concussion, broke my helmet in half, broke my arm, road rash. And so I was a mess. Actually, funny story. While I was laying semi-conscious at the hospital, Henry Crete came to the hospital to see me, and he laid 2 coins on my eyes to give to the boat keeper for the river Styx, and he thought that was hilarious. So
I found it more kind of morbid and a little odd personally when I read that.
I'll never forget it though.
No.
Yeah, so what happened? We realized, like, I can't work right now. Like I can't, because of my injuries. I couldn't do kind of the labor job, which was sort of the only job open to me at the time. And at that point, Erin's parents said, "Well, hey, if you move in with us, we'll put you up for free. You and your baby, we'll put you up for free while you go back to school." And then my parents said, "Well, if you move in with them, we'll pay for your tuition and books." So, problem was, that was up in Vernon. So that's a 5-hour drive away from our church. And back then, you just didn't do that. You just didn't go that far away.
Right.
And I remember going to the evangelist at the time to say, "Hey, like, what do you think? I mean, we have this opportunity. I don't think I can pass it up." And so he actually wrote a letter and read it to the church saying, "Hey, Sean and Erin, they're going up to the Okanagan for a couple of years so Sean can finish his degree. They're not falling away. They're still disciples. We're gonna support them." And so we did. We moved 5 hours away, and suddenly we were in the wilderness. We were in the middle of nowhere. And what it did is, first of all, we were super isolated. We started looking for a local church to attend, and we found a local mainline Church of Christ. And so we attended there for a few years. And what's interesting is around the same time, Mela and Andy were moving there from Japan.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and they've got 3 kids, or roughly the same age as our kids, and so it was just a God moment. God really took care of us, and what it did, I believe that it helped me to see my faith from a new perspective. And one of the, that book Repentance by Ed Anton? He talked about this idea of going away and being consecrated and then coming back. Right. I really feel like I had that kind of an experience where I was allowed to see the world, see our family of churches through a new set of eyes. And that's, I think my thinking was forever changed after that. I got up close and personal with the mainline Church of Christ, and it helped me to see some of how we developed as a family of churches, for better or worse.
Right.
And I'm super grateful for that.
I definitely felt that. There's definitely a before and after Sean St. Jean in the book that you're writing about. Your experiences prior to that, the roughly 10 years prior to that accident and experience up there, and then coming back. I was kind of a Jeremiah Johnson out in the wilderness coming back. But we'll talk more about that. Mm-hmm. Why did you choose counseling? I mean, you're delivering stuff, you're working odd jobs, you don't have a degree. Why'd you just settle on that?
Mm-hmm. There's a few reasons. One of the reasons is I love discipling. I've always loved it. I had a couple of young men, when I was 18 years old, speak into my life and really counsel me. They really helped me to know Jesus. And my early discipleship partners were really instrumental in helping me to grow. I had some really great disciplers and some not so great disciplers. I was also not probably the best discipler at times. And I remember at one point I had this one brother who I was discipling, and I know now that he was easily diagnosable with major depressive disorder. Like he was really depressed, and it was clinical. But I had no education at the time. And as we were walking along the road, he said, "Sean, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but I just don't think you're qualified to help me in the way you think you are." And that kind of stung a little bit. And my first instinct was, yeah, you are prideful for saying that. But then as I reflected on it, I realized he's right. I didn't have the skill set to help him.
Right. Right.
And so that set me on a journey back to school, because I wanted to be able to be a better helper.
Okay, so you're up in the Okanagan recovering. Is there a school up there? Is that where you got your degree?
Yeah, UBC, University of British Columbia, has an Okanagan campus. So I got a clinical master of social work degree there. And then
Is that the name of the town, Okanagan, or is that the county or
that's kind of
state?
like a county. It's a region of
Okay.
BC. Yeah.
How many people there that they have a college campus?
A couple 100,000.
Okay,
Kelowna,
so
yeah.
it's more populous than that I would anticipate.
Right.
Spread over a large area, kind of rural.
Yeah, I was living in a place called Spallamsheen, which is
Okay.
very sparsely populated, maybe 10,000 people in that whole area.
I just have to laugh when you say as you looked over the lake.
Oh yeah, it gets really hot. We work in Celsius. It was 50 degrees a few years ago. I don't even know what that is in Fahrenheit. It's like 130 or something, but it can get really hot.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Okay. Why'd you write the book Spiritual Trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. So over the last 5 to 8 years, I've had more and more disciples come to me for therapy. And what I found was that there were these re-emerging themes, like these themes that were coming up time and time again. I found myself having the same kind of conversation with people over and over again around spiritual hurts, around their history, around their past in the church. And I realized that there were like I'm a researcher, so I've got a PhD in social work and sociology, and so I when I'm counseling people, I've got my therapist hat on, but I'm also thinking as a researcher. I'm always looking to link themes across people in any given situation, and I came to realize, wow, there are some commonly held needs that if I wrote a book about, I could probably meet some of those needs,
Right.
for certainly a lot, cheaper than hiring me by
Right.
the hour, and I love books. Books have changed my life, and I'm very grateful for them. And they're kind of a secret weapon to
Oh
help
yeah.
us to change.
Oh yeah. Well, I got to say, you're a really good writer. I mean, I read this and I'm like, oh, I mean, there's, back in the day, people would put together books through DPI and stuff, and you could just tell it was like, Joe Blow, hey, I need you to write an article on evangelism and throw it in there and just kind of make a compilation. But this was really good. I mean, I read a ton of books also, and I was like, wow, you got some skills. I don't know if it sounds like your wife was involved, so maybe that was like giving you a little boost, but it was really well written.
Thank you. I mean, I did a lot of writing for my PhD, and of course, when you're doing doctoral level work, you never just write something and put it out there. There's just continual revisions and critique. So I got very comfortable with having my work critiqued and refining over and over again. And so when I wrote the book, first of all, I prayed to God. I said, God, help me write a useful book. That's all I want, is just to write a book that helps people. And because of that, I submitted the book to as many people as I could. And I had some really great early feedback. In fact, the first version of this book, I'm glad will never see the light of day, because I realized that as I was writing it, I had some of my own stuff to still work through.
Well, I want to get more into it, but I'll come back to that in the book. And I went through this, and I have highlighted a lot of this stuff. I mean, I find it really interesting. But in the book, you talk about different levels of trauma. You call them your ABCs. There's atrocious abuse. There's biblical lording over, and then there's conformity culture, ABC. What's the difference, and why'd you break it down that way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had realized when I did a bit of a lit review, looking at what's been written about religious trauma, spiritual trauma, that none of the definitions seem to fit very well, especially with our family of churches. Like you've probably heard there's like the Hillsong documentary about some of the stuff that went on there.
Right. There's Mark Driscoll, there's Mars Hill,
Yes.
all that stuff.
Yeah, and hey, there was some really bad stuff that happened there, but it was qualitatively very different than what we've experienced because our churches are very different than those churches. And so the model just didn't seem to fit us very well. The other thing I didn't like about the model of spiritual abuse and spiritual trauma is that it always assumes a perpetrator, meaning there's always a bad guy in the story that needs to be punished.
Exactly.
And I just, on a practical level, don't know that that's the way to actually fix some of the problems that we find in the church. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact is, you've got people in churches who do truly atrocious things, like like pedophilia and like awful stuff.
Right.
And then you've got people who they're like a young campus intern that might have said something harsh one day. Like, are they really in the same category? Like we can't speak about them in the same breath. It's just not true, and it's certainly not fair. And so I realized we need a little more nuance to the conversation. And so I split the conversation into 3 categories. So atrocious abuse, that's the A category. These are the things that no one would ever dispute are abusive. These are things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, extreme humiliation. They tend, that they fall into that category because you probably need to call the police when they happen.
Exactly. That's right.
You're not getting a huge fight from people.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that cover-ups don't happen and that there's some enabling that can happen, but generally speaking, we know what to do when that happens. We seek help. We get help. That's the right choice every single time. And the reason, and hey, I've heard lots of stories about people going through those kinds of things. And so I don't want to minimize their pain. There's a definite route forward for them, and they should be acknowledged at minimum. Fortunately, I don't believe they're the largest group of people who have been wounded in our churches. Thank God for that.
Yeah.
So the next category, the B category, I call biblical lording over. Not to say that lording over is biblical, meaning like you should be lording over. I'll just be honest and say I needed a B word to fit the ABC model. But we talk about things like bullying, belligerence. We say, let's actually let the Bible define what it means to be abusive as a leader. And the Bible does a great job of defining that. I mean, Jesus himself, he said, hey, the Gentiles lorded over their people, but, whoever wants to be the leader must be a servant to all, in the kingdom of God. And then he demonstrates by washing his disciples' feet. You know what strikes me? Do you know what happens right before Jesus washes his disciples' feet?
Nope.
This recognition that all power has been given to him, that God has put everything under him. And so Jesus' response to being given supreme and ultimate power was to lower himself.
Wow.
And truly become a servant.
That's pretty awesome.
It's stunning, right?
It is.
That's real. That's what Jesus calls leaders to, for real. And the Bible's enough for us to learn how to lead the way God would have us lead. And so, yeah, we can point to certain behaviors, practices, words that people do in the church that are frankly ungodly. They're abusive. The reason why those words hurt so much is because, if you're a person in power in the church and you speak to someone in a harsh way or in a way that hurts them, not only are you hurting them directly, but you're communicating a message, which is that you're not really worth very much. You're an object to do with as I please.
Right.
And that really hurts people. And so, yeah, it's not good. Fortunately, I actually don't think that's the majority of the woundedness people have experienced in our family of churches either. It does exist. It has happened. It does happen. But I actually think that the C category is the most common way that people get hurt, which is, I refer to it as conformity culture. And what that means is it speaks to the fact that we are a body, we're a group, we naturally conform to one another. Like every group conforms.
Right.
Whether you're working somewhere at an office,
Right.
if part of a police force, you're going to be like the other police in, your unit. We're humans, we're mammals, we're social creatures, so we naturally conform for all kinds of reasons, but that's for good or for bad. So we will naturally become like the people we surround ourselves with, for better or worse. And so what's happened is many people have actually done things to hurt other people, but they've done so sincerely, with a sincere conscience and like a heart to really want to love and honor and obey God. Usually it's a kind of immaturity. Like, I think back to my early days, I used to say crazy stuff because I thought it was radical, because I thought it was like what God wanted me to say. And I look back and I'm like, oh gosh, like I wish I hadn't said some of that stuff. I just thought it was so spiritual at the time. And I know I hurt people with those words, but my heart wasn't to hurt them.
Right.
It was truly to help them. So one way to think about A and B category stuff is that those are done in bad faith. Those are done with an intent to harm on some level. Things done under the C category are done in good faith, meaning they were done in the name of God. Now, it might have been misguided, but it was done sincerely. I liken it to, like, imagine you're walking across the street on a crosswalk, and as you're walking across, there's a car and it hits you. You get run over. So now you're lying on the street, you're bleeding, you're broken. It really matters whether or not that person accidentally ran you over or whether they ran you over on purpose. Right?
It
doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's a little easier to forgive if they got distracted, they were looking at something else. But if you find out they were actually aiming to hit you, that's a whole different issue.
Oh, yeah.
But here's the thing. Whether or not they hit you on purpose or by accident, you're still lying on the pavement bleeding.
Right.
So I think sometimes when people hear that, they hear, oh, like, you're saying my pain isn't real. You're saying my hurt's not real. They feel kind of invalidated by that, which is not what I'm trying to say. If you've been hit by a truck, you've been hit by a truck. And I have some empathy for you because I know what that's like. For real. But the intent really does matter at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good. Okay. This is where I feel like you're going to really rob people of their sense of, like, okay, Sean is going to go to bat for us, and he's going to take on all those bad people that hurt me and that messed up my life. In reading the book, I felt like, ooh, Sean is taking like a really impartial, like, middle road. And I think, in thinking this, I thought, for people who have experienced trauma, I wonder if they're thinking, well, Sean, you don't know my situation. This person really hurt me. And you're saying that it was just kind of part of the air we breathe. There is the culture. And it seems almost like those people would feel like you're stealing away their validation, their sense of, like, hey, I'm going to get back against the bad people, the people that hurt me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. It's a good point. And of course, that hurts me on a deep level too, as a therapist, as an empathetic person. And it's a tough situation. The way we're hurt is very subjective. Like, two people can hear the same words. One person will feel wounded by it and another won't. There's a reason for that. And more often than not, what I found is that oftentimes we're wounded long before we're ever part of the church.
Okay.
Like when we really dig deep, like when I dig deep in therapy with people, I find out it wasn't actually so much that discipler that said that thing. It's that when they said that thing, it reminded them of something their dad said to them. Like, you're an idiot. Like,
Right.
you're just taking up space on the earth. Like, I mean, the level of creativity on the part of parents, some parents who say egregious things to their kids is off
It's
the
crazy.
charts.
Yeah.
And I hear these every day. I hear these awful, invalidating comments, these wounding comments. And yeah, so that creates a wound where somebody who maybe they're off track and maybe they shouldn't have said that thing in the church, but it's like this. Imagine like we're in the fellowship and I can't come over to give you a big side hug. Right? And now that's normal. We give side hugs a lot in the church,
Right.
right?
Sure.
But as I grab onto your shoulder, you like buckle and like wince and yelp and fall to the ground. And I go, whoa, like what's that about? And then you sort of roll up your sleeve and I realize you've got like this wound there, this festering wound.
Right. Right.
And it hurts. And I just grabbed it. And like, of course it brought you to your knees.
Right.
Now, I didn't know you had that wound there. If I had known, I wouldn't have given you that side hug because I care about you and I don't want to hurt you. The fact is, for most people, that's an appropriate hug. Like most of us who aren't wounded, somebody can grab us on the shoulder and we're fine.
Right.
But if we have a wound there, we can't.
Right.
The problem is these are psychological and emotional wounds. And so we have a really hard time seeing those wounds in other people, Now imagine if I grabbed your shoulder and you winced and fell to the ground and I was like, what? That shouldn't hurt. It doesn't hurt me. Like, that'd be kind of unfair, right?
It would be.
We hug people like that in this church. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be here.
Right.
Right? We'd never say that to you. Because we can see the wound. Like, it's awful. We'd be like, oh gosh, like, do you need something? Like, should we go to the hospital? So like, after I find out you've got the wound, I am now sinning if I continue to hug you that way.
That's right.
Because now I know you've been hurt there. So
that's one of the things that it really impacted me in the book. You've got so many great pithy physical examples to illustrate, fuzzy spiritual, emotional issues that we face. I think that's what's really, really good about the book. On page 78, you write, whenever there's a powerful emotion that has control of your mind and heart, there's always a thought or belief living under it. And in the book, you claim that insight is worth the price of the book alone. Mm-hmm. Okay. Why is that so important? Can you just kind of expand on that a little bit?
So we're created in God's image. And the Bible says that God spoke the world into existence. And in the same way, we speak our own worlds into existence. For better or worse. We have this ability to tell stories about our lives. It's how we can convey information to each other. Through storytelling. You can tell me a story, and in my mind, I'm brought to that exact place that you're trying to tell me about. And that's really cool, because it means that we can experience all kinds of things without actually being there personally. What it also means is that we are constantly interpreting what's happening to us in the world. Our brains are these locked-in prediction engines that are trying to survive. And we survive by learning and telling ourselves stories about the way the world is so that we can survive. The problem is we're also wired for problems. We're wired for threat. There's research where they showed people an unhappy face in a sea of happy faces, and they basically measured how long it took for them to find the unhappy face in the sea of happy faces. Then they showed people a happy face in a sea of unhappy faces, and they measured how long it would take to find that happy face. And people found the unhappy face 3 times faster.
Wow.
We are wired for threat.
Oh, yeah.
And so what that means is that we will very naturally tell stories that amplify the level of threat in our life, that will amplify the amount of pain in our life. And the problem is those stories, they might feel true, but they're often not objectively true. Mm. And so, I mean, just to give you an example, there's this German billionaire who took his own life in 2009. He was the 5th richest man in Germany for a while.
Oh my gosh.
And he was very industrious, made his own money over many decades. And when the 2008 crash hit, he lost about 500 million euros, which is like, I don't know, maybe 5% of his fortune, a little, maybe 6% of his fortune. And he felt like a failure. And he took his own life.
Oh my gosh.
And yeah, we say, oh my gosh, we look at that guy, we go, dude, you were a billionaire. Like, how on earth did you feel like a failure?
Right.
But yet he did. Because he lived in a world of his own construction.
Okay, go easy, because you're stepping on sensitive ground. I think people who are achievers definitely feel like they understand what you're talking about there. That's for sure. That's good. Okay. Yeah. In the book, you have some tools that you use to help with trauma. Mm-hmm. You talk about the reality sorting grid and the truth gauntlet. Those are cool. You better put a copyright little C on those things. That's pretty cool.
That's funny.
And how do they help? Can you just kind of give a little highlight? And because this is right in your book, mm-hmm. and you say these things are very helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, to be real, I'm building on what's gone before me. This is classical cognitive behavioral therapy we're talking about here. So, basically, the reality sorting grid is it's a chart that you can create that has categories. So it starts with situation, and then based on that situation, you have a thought, which is like an interpretation of that situation. Okay. Based on the thought, an emotion is produced.
Right.
Based on the emotion that's produced, you take a certain kind of action or not take action. And then there's an end result. And if you think about how life happens, that's sort of the pattern for most of us.
Yep.
So most of us, we can tell you kind of how we feel about something, but because the underlying thought might be so painful, it might be intolerably painful, we may actually push it out of our minds. And that's where a lot of the good work of therapy happens. So I'll give you an example. Like, the example in the book was I was working with this young lady who was stood up on a date, and she'd been looking forward to this date for like a week, and then this guy texted her hours before and said, "Hey, I'm sorry I can't come," and didn't really give her a good reason why. She came to see me after spending 2 weeks in bed. She hadn't gone to work. She hadn't gone to class. She kind of locked herself in with deeply depressive symptoms. And as we unpacked what happened for her, we were able to narrow the whole thing down to a couple of really sinister thoughts. So you know what she told herself when that guy stood her up, he basically stood her up, she had a series of thoughts. He probably stood me up because he saw me on Facebook, or he realized who I was, and he decided he really didn't want to meet with me, which is one thought. The next thought was, come to think of it, I'm probably not that much of a catch. I'm not that great a person. I'm probably never going to get married. I'm never going to have children, and I'm going to die alone.
Oh.
And the thing is, if those thoughts were objectively true, like if we knew for certain that she was unlovable, that she had no worth, that she would never get married, she would die alone, if that was objectively true, I think staying in bed for a couple of weeks is a reasonable reaction to that.
Right.
Because that's such a great loss. But the thing is, we don't know that that's true. It's probably not true.
Right.
And so all of those extreme emotions are gatekept by the thought that produces them.
Wow.
Like, think about, like if I wanted to make you upset, I could tell you that a family member of yours had died, and I could be lying to you, but what would happen? You would like probably stop the interview, and you would jump up and you'd run upstairs and you'd get on the phone, and you would react emotionally.
Yeah.
Even if it's a lie, you would react because if you believe it's true, then it's true.
Yeah.
Right?
It reminds me of a story I read in a book by Brian Tracy, and he said, how impacting your thoughts are. He said, imagine you go on a sales trip. Of course, this is a business book. And he says, you go on a sales trip to New York. Every door you hit, they shut the door in your face. You're just super discouraged. You call back to your wife, and she senses you're a little bit down. So she says, hey, forget it. Don't worry about it. Guess what I found out? We just won the lottery today. We got $1 million. So just don't worry about it. And so the guy finishes his sales trip, but he's fired up, and he's all of a sudden he starts doing really well, because even when he gets turned down, he's pumped up because he knows he's got $1 million waiting for him at home. Goes home. His wife says, where's the $1 million? And she says, oh, I just sensed you were down. So I just kind of told you that. He's like, what? But it does show you how, even if it's not based on truth, it can absolutely dictate your actions, your feelings, and everything else about going on in your life.
You bet. And frankly, Satan wants you to believe a lie that will send you out the door.
Yeah.
He wants you to give up your relationship with God.
Yeah. Okay. In this discussion, you talked about this woman, and then you really go into this concept of worth and worthy. Worthlessness. You talked about how in your practice, that's probably the most common issue, is a deep-seated feeling of worthlessness in your patients. I love the idea so much. I actually used it in my sermon because I'm like, that's a great point. I loved how you dissect the difference between worth and worthy. They're only separated by one letter, but I mean, just worlds apart. Can you break down the differences there and just go into that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. Whenever there's strong emotion in the counseling office, it almost always boils down to some feeling of uselessness or worthlessness. When we just get right to the bottom of it. And one of the problems, and you see these memes all over the place, I'm enough, and after the Barbie movie, I'm Knuff, right? There's that T-shirt, and there's this fixation on saying, "Oh, I'm worthy, I'm enough," and sorry, I'm getting a call. Oh, sorry, I cut out there. And yeah, there's this fixation on I'm worthy, I'm enough. And it's actually kind of a lie. I mean, scripturally, we've fallen short. We're not worthy. Only one person in the history of the world is worthy, and that's Jesus. Right. Worthy is the Lamb that was slain. He was worthy to open the scroll. Right. I mean, why was there weeping in heaven? Because there was no one found worthy to open the scroll. Right. No one is righteous, not even one. But here's the thing. That's worthiness. That means you've lived a sinless life. You've run the gauntlet. You've climbed your own way into heaven on your own merit, and that you deserve to be there. Right. Because you got there under your own steam. None of us can make that claim. Only Jesus can make that claim. Yeah. And he sort of flexes with it, right? Like he's like, I lay down my life just to pick it up again. Like the cross was his triumph. Yeah. Right? It was not weakness for him. He chose to lay down his life. So I think we can all understand that on that level we're not worthy. But what are we worth? What are we worth to God? And the fact is, we all understand this intrinsically. If you're holding your newborn baby, what are they worth to you?
Oh my gosh. Right,
But
you
but
can't
hang
even.
on. Sorry, say
Go
again.
ahead.
I was
I
going
mean,
to
you just
say,
can't. You just can't put a price on it. It's just
y-
it's
yeah,
not something you can measure.
they're absolutely priceless. But hang on, they haven't earned their keep though. When's the last time your newborn did the dishes, or earned some income for the family, or changed his own diapers?
Right, right,
Right?
exactly.
Like
Great
we
point.
understand that that's nonsense. Like,
Right,
how could they possibly?
right,
But yet, when it comes to our Christian lives, somehow we feel like we have to measure up.
right.
And this is where I think we get ourselves into trouble, especially when we speak about like standards or God's standards. I actually think that's a bit of a human invention. I think it's more the Pharisees that talk about standards. And we get into very dangerous territory because when we say standard, what we're saying is, yes, we're saved by God's grace and measuring up. And that gets us into tough territory
Right.
spiritually.
Yeah.
Because what it means is we now feel like we need to earn our salvation. We need to do the prescribed stuff in order to warrant being allowed into heaven. That's not what grace is.
Okay, so let's.
Haha.
Can you bring that?
Yeah, yeah.
Can you put some flesh on that? Like, what does that look like when you're talking to somebody? Like,
I know.
what are the symptoms?
I can feel myself getting in trouble as I speak, but um, it it's not about the what but the why. The why really matters.
Hmm.
If you love your wife, or let's say if you love your girlfriend and you want her to be your wife, and you bring her flowers, you cook dinner for her, you do all this stuff. Is it because you feel like you have to in order for her to love you, or is it because you just love her so much?
Right.
You just want to express your love in every way you can. I mean, we all see this, like in early young marriages, where each spouse is just spontaneously doing things for the other spouse
Right.
because they love them so much, and it brings them true happiness to see their spouse happy.
Yeah.
But then, in the course of time, in most marriages, you start to see the cracks. You start to realize, oh, we have flaws. We're sinning against each other because we're sinners, and marriages can become a little transactional. And it's like, I'll do this for you if you do this for me, and that gets us into real trouble in a marriage because
Oh
then it
yeah.
becomes this legal requirement, like you have to do things for each other.
Right.
The marriages that truly heal, they go back to their first love, as Jesus says.
Yeah.
They become like they were at first, doing things just because they love each other. And that's really the call for us. It's like, I'm not saying we shouldn't, evangelize the world. I'm not saying we shouldn't obey the scriptures, but the why really matters. The
Right.
Pharisees were really good at obeying the scriptures because that's how they felt justified. It's how they felt safe and secure, like they were going to be okay. Like they had some value because they were the dutiful older brother that stuck around when the younger brother went off to fool around.
Right. Okay, this is where it gets really dicey. And this is where I mean, I feel like there in our family of churches, which is the ICOCs, in the churches that you and I were both converted into, um, I feel like there's kind of a growing, not tribalism, but definitely like camp. There's the spiritual formation group, like let's focus on our motives, let's focus on our relationship with God. And then there's you could call it the traditional camp, which is like, let's get out and save the world. Let's obey Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And the tricky part is Jesus's teaching is absolutely mixed in my mind with both things 100% on both levels. I mean, you read the end of the Sermon on the Mount and he rips off like 3 stories in a row about how you better obey and put into practice my teachings or else you're going to be left outside the door. So it's hard not to come away with that feeling from the Bible like, hey, I got to obey.
Mm-hmm.
I got to do what Jesus says. I mean, that's the Lord of creation. James has the same spirit. But on the other hand, there's so many things like, whoever the Father brings to me, I'll never cast away. I'll never send away. I mean, there's so much love and encouragement. That's why I feel like it's frustrating to me, because I feel like you can't separate that soul and spirit, the joints and marrow, because they're both so deeply intertwined. To separate one out would just kind of eviscerate the gospel in my mind. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I appreciate the struggle and the tension there. In fact, I thought about writing a book called It's Both, because so often in Scripture there is
that would be a great title.
Messaging, right? Yeah, there you go.
Exactly. Absolutely.
You heard it here first. Yeah. I think it really matters. I think standpoint matters. And what I mean by that is, like, we all have different struggles. Like, if we think about, like, Mary and Martha. Martha was being, I mean, gosh, can I just acknowledge Martha for a minute? She was stressed out. Right. She's running around the house trying to get stuff done.
Yep.
Right? Her sister is just sitting there doing nothing, just sitting at Jesus' feet. She should have known about all the stuff that needed to get done.
Right.
So I actually really relate to Martha.
Sure.
I think Martha had a good point.
I mean, if someone of Jesus' stature shows up in your house, I mean, it's all points bulletin. You better get on your feet and do something.
Yes, exactly. And here's the thing. Like, we have to appreciate different people can be in the same room, but they come from different standpoints.
Right.
I'll give you an example. Sometimes when we have company coming, my wife will be stressed out, running around the house, crazy cleaning. Like that crazy cleaning you do before company comes.
Oh yeah.
And it's like hours of work. and what's funny is once they arrive, the house can totally descend into madness again. But it's like the presentation. When the guests arrive, it has to be pristine.
Oh yeah.
And so many times I would say, honey, like, it doesn't matter. These are our friends. They don't care if it's messy.
Right.
And I sincerely meant that. But what I didn't realize, and what she helped me to understand, is like, okay, like, as the husband, yeah, like, you have never been judged for that. Me as the wife, I get judged all the time.
Wow.
It's like, like, if you're away on a business trip and I'm watching the kids as the wife, yeah, it's just par for the course. But if my wife's away on a trip and I'm watching the kids, I'm a hero. Oh, like, you're babysitting your kids for the weekend? Like, no, actually, they are my biological children. I'm caring for them as their parent. So we can see that, like, there are different expectations on different people. And I mean, I look at the story of the prodigal son. Like, we have prodigals in our church that they are taking their freedom of Christ to the bank and they are running with it.
Right.
And there are a few older brothers in the fellowship going, that's not right. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. But then the older brother also has his own sin. Like, the older brother, what does he say? Dad, I've been slaving for you for years and you haven't given me anything.
Right.
And the father's going, what are you talking about? All things are yours. Like, all I have is yours.
Right.
And I think that same dynamic is happening with some of that tribalism where you have people that naturally are a prodigal and people who are naturally an older brother. They just see the world through that lens. And Jesus has a message for each of them that's different. But the problem is, if you're wired as an older brother, you're going to hear all those hardcore, Luke 9, like, unless you give up everything and follow me, you cannot be my... That's going to register. That's going to hit for you because you're a responsible older brother. You're wired that way. Yeah. And if you're a prodigal who's, like, free and easy, just kind of happy to be here, you're going to hear my burden is light, my yoke is light. And you're going to take that to the bank because that's how you naturally identify. And so we need the cross messaging to kind of hold us in a good spot.
Absolutely. It's funny to me because I read books and I'll read stuff that comes from evangelical sources. And it's interesting as I read these new books with new insights from famous church leaders or authors. And they're like, hey, here's a new insight. You can't be a Christian unless you're a disciple. You need to be a disciple to be a Christian. I'm like, dude, this is like 50 years old. This is like the foundation of our movement. But on the other hand, our movement is kind of moving away from that even though that's something that we stressed 50 years ago or 40 years ago. Issues like, baptism. I hear people like Francis chant, "Hey, you need to repent and get baptized." I go, that's good. Something that's kind of our foundation, but I see us kind of drifting away from those moorings. And so I find that troubling to me, because I feel like things that we emphasized rightly are being discovered as new material. It's almost reminds me of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And Meriwether Lewis was an amazing botanist. He recorded all sorts of new plant life crossing the continent of the North American continent. Just recorded everything, all these massive discoveries, just, the biggest ever. Comes back, but because he's got like a procrastination problem or a depressive issue, doesn't publish it, even though he gets prodded by President Jefferson. And people who went there 50 years later discovered it, and they got the credit for his discoveries. And it's just so sad to me, such a waste. So I would hate for us to abandon those things that are good, simply because it's like, oh, that's old school. Mm-hmm. And what is often old school to us is just revolutionary to other denominations. So I think there's some danger there. Okay, but I want to get this discussion is about you. It's not about me. So let's keep going here. Oh, I just want to have a little side. You've got so many good stories. I want to go back to your writing and analogies. Like, I love this. Part of the recovery process is a bit like untangling a set of wired earbuds that have been in your pocket too long. Okay, you've got so many little nuggets like that. You talk about, like, I'm going to take you into the dark forest here. We're going to go into the darkness. You better get ready. I mean, I just love it. I know this is, you didn't ask me to praise you, but I thought it was really good.
Thank you.
Let's get back to your method for recovery. What can you outline it? Can you just give a brief for someone who's struggling with spiritual trauma, who's had bad experiences in the church? Just outline it. How do you help a person?
Yeah, it's a good question. And for the record, I actually have some tangled earbuds in my pocket, so that was an easy one to grab. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's some general steps, I think. The first step, and this isn't just for people wanting to recover, but this is for church leaders as well. It's a bit of triage. Like, find out, like, is that person safe? Like, that should be number one. Are you safe? Because if you're in a situation that's unsafe, then probably fleeing to safety is step one. So now there's a difference between feeling unsafe and being unsafe, which is tough to tease apart, but most recovery models have three broad phases when it comes to healing. The first is finding a sense of safety. The second is remembering the thing that happened to you and mourning what happened. And then the third phase is reconnection. And they tend to be linear to a degree. Like, it's hard to remember and mourn if you don't feel safe to do that. It's hard to reconnect if you haven't remembered and mourned. And so, I mean, the book provides a broad guide for that, what that might look like.
Okay, I want to interrupt you right there. So I'm going to put you on the hot seat here. So are you telling people they should leave church or leave the fellowship if they're experiencing trauma?
No, not directly. This is, hey, like, I prayed about some of those parts of my book before I wrote it. I think we've got to understand a couple things. First of all, we are the church. We don't go to church. We are the church. Right. I believe in the one true church. I believe that Jesus knows those who are his, regardless of their geographical location. And so when we talk about, like, leaving church, I mean, there's a few ways that one can leave church. There's, like, taking a step back for a little bit. There is, like, leaving the membership and, like, no longer being a member of that church. And then there's like falling away from God. And those are three distinct states. I think it's very dangerous for us to equate them somehow, using human logic. God knows those who are his. I think we're going to get to heaven one day. We're going to find people there that we did not expect to be there. And
Right.
we're going to find that there are people who aren't there that we did expect to be there. So we just need to have a bit of humility around that.
Right.
But what I would say is, it's a little bit like leaving your marriage. I don't say that lightly. I don't go, and there are some therapists who will say, oh, why don't you just get a divorce? Oh, you're having marriage problems? You're not living your best life? Oh, just find a new spouse. That's obviously not righteous. That's not the right way to go about it. But if you're being like physically abused in your relationship with your spouse, maybe it's okay if they won't stop for you to leave the home.
Right.
Like, I don't think many of us would argue that.
Right. Right.
So again, this is where the ABC thing comes in.
Right.
So like, if there is ongoing atrocious abuse that you are unable to stop from happening, yeah, get out of there.
Absolutely.
You know?
Just run away.
That's right. Now, what's interesting about biblical lording over, you know what Jesus said about the Pharisees? He said a bunch of things about the Pharisees, but at one point he said, leave them, you know? Right. So like, there is a time to leave. Like if you feel like your salvation is at stake because you're being so wounded and it's hurting your heart to the point where you could see yourself walking away from God, like, please leave that fellowship.
Right.
Like, don't stay there. Like, now that doesn't necessarily mean leaving our family of churches. Like, I know lots of people that have moved cities, you know, because they want to be a part of our family of churches, but that local situation is just not workable for them.
Exactly.
And we see that in Scripture too. You know, we see, people, Paul and Barnabas, coming to sharp dispute and kind of parting ways, and they both probably needed a breather in that case. And the nice thing was, 2,000 years ago, you could have a breather because there was no Instagram. You had like 4 years to think and pray about that brother who hurt you before you saw him again, you know?
Exactly. Well, so, I think about the situation when I planted a church in Ashland, Oregon. And, I think a lot of people were convinced that I'd just fallen away because I went to a traditional church for about, I'd say 3 months while I was getting the paperwork for a startup church, an ICOC church started. And it was great. I mean, I enjoyed it. There was certainly some big differences between the traditional church. I never once thought I've fallen away from God. I mean, I had to convince people, hey, I'm still here. I'm still alive, still, loving the gospel. I'm actually planting a church. But you're right. I mean, it has a lot of nuance. And that's what I appreciate about your book, is I feel like you're not giving people just quick sound bites. You're breaking it down and saying, hey, think it through. Don't make a villain out of everybody, and just make the right decision. So that was really, really good. Okay. And that leads to this next one. Again, going back to, I feel like you're going to get heat from people on both sides of the spiritual spectrum. I'm a church leader, and I'm reading some of your stuff. I'm like, oh, I feel naturally defensive about our family of churches. I love our family of churches. I love our past. I love our history. I love the boldness. And that comes out in your writing too. Just talking about the William Wallace, let's go take, let's paint our faces purple and go charge. And that appreciation comes out, but I love that. On the other hand, it's become very popular these days to just bash on the church and, just to be able to point out all the weaknesses, real or imagined, from the past, and genuine abuse or genuine issues or genuine things that came up and imagined or exaggerated or, overexpanded or whatever. And so I feel like people are going to, like I said before, some are going to hate the fact that you don't just roast the Church of Christ and just don't take a hard stand. On the other hand, for people who are happy with the church, or in general happy. I'm sure everyone's experienced some type of trauma in the kind of culture we're part of. It's a more aggressive, let's make a disciple kind of culture. I think there's going to be blowback from that. I don't know. Maybe you've already experienced it. I thought one of your strongest phrases is you said, God allowed your spiritual trauma to happen. Okay, that's a bomb drop right there. Mm-hmm. Okay, can you expand on that? Give a little context of what you're saying there.
Yeah. Gosh, and there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to say, but and that, I could see how I could get skewered for that comment. Jesus was made perfect through suffering. God uses adversity. That's why in James he says, consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything.
Right.
That's true. It's also extremely painful. And I think sometimes when people hear words like that, like, oh, God has used this to refine you, what they hear is, oh, that shouldn't bother you so much. Right. It couldn't be that painful. No, I believe you. It's really, really painful. That's why it changes you. And so there's a duality there. We have to acknowledge that, God uses these awful things. I mean, this is like Joseph in Genesis 50, verse 19 and 20. Right. Joseph was literally sold into slavery. Pretty awful. And yet he was able to reframe. He was able to reframe what had happened to him. And he said, look, what you intended me harm, but God used it for good. And then it says he used many other words to speak kindly. He spoke kindly to them, to his siblings.
Yeah.
It's tough. It's this tough reality. And the problem is, when someone else tells you that, it can sound kind of cheap. You're just throwing away my emotions. Right. So I would never recommend that if somebody tells you something really painful, that you say, oh, well, God did that. He probably thought you needed to grow in that area. No, I'm not saying that at all. Gosh, it's the worst thing you can do. Please don't ever. And this is with loss. I hear this happening. People they lost their mom, and it's oh, well, it's what are you trying to say to them? That makes no sense. But in the course of time, it's a realization we each have to have for ourselves.
Right.
And that's very different. That's different than someone telling us that.
Right.
When we recognize that God uses adversity, even really painful things, to mold and change us and use us for his purposes, we have a superpower.
Yeah. That's one thing I really appreciate. You go back to the scriptures, there's a faithfulness to the scriptures. And I like that, because I go, that's the way it should be. And it's not easy, but it is true. I've gone through who hasn't gone through really difficult times? But then you're right. Over time, after things heal up, you can kind of look back and go, oh, God let that happen to me. I mean, I wouldn't want that to happen again, but it did. And something good happened. So really, really great point. Okay. As a church leader, I can't help but read the book and ask, why would a person want to lead a church ministry knowing that it's so easy to create trauma? Mm-hmm. I mean, these are tough times for ministers. I feel for ministers. I recently went to a ministers retreat in San Diego, and old friends getting out of the ministry, old friends relocating. It's hitting the ranks of ministers. It's hard to find ministers. It's hard to find replacements for ministry positions.
Yep.
And, even in your own church, we're facing this leadership crisis. Your own church, back in December, maybe you filled the position, is lacking leadership. You guys were wearing t-shirts hey, how'd you like to move to Vancouver?
Right.
I got to be honest with you, Sean. I'd hesitate taking a position there, knowing I'm preaching to the trauma expert there every Sunday. I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, did I hit the trauma bell? Did I say something wrong?" How can a leader who's listening to this navigate these choppy waters without just turning into a say nothing, do nothing kind of a person?
Yeah. No, that's a really great question. It's a little bit like the way parenting is going right now. It's like there's this feeling like to be a good parent, you have to become your child's therapist and speak to them like a therapist. But that's not the relationship. Like like I work with youth, and I speak to them as a therapist. And I actually had a colleague once say, so there's a story. There was this kid who had taken some money. This was money meant to get him into a summer program. She's a social worker working with him. And she gave him the money to pay for this program, but he took it and spent it on like video games or something. And she was like really stressed out about it. She realized that she kind of misstepped with this client. So she came to my office. She's like, Sean, like, what do I do about this? Like, if this was your kid, what would you do? And I said, oh, let me stop you there. As a social worker, I would say, you got me, kiddo. I'm still going to put you in that program. I'm just going to pay them directly the second time because, like, good job, you got me. That's if I'm the social worker. If I'm that child's father and he took the money I gave him for a program and spent it on video games, not only is he not going to be doing that program, he's going to be mowing lawns until he pays me back. Because I'm his father. I'm not his counselor.
Right.
And I think it's a little bit the same with ministers. They're kind of expected to be like these therapists now.
Right.
And that's not actually their role. Now, it involves pastoral care, and yes, there's a call for them to have a high EQ, but that's not their primary role. And so, to speak to your point about people going out the door, I think one of the reasons they're going out the door is because they don't feel equipped to do what their congregation is expecting them to do.
I agree. I absolutely agree. It's like the job description has changed over the course of the past 40 years. People who were trained 40 years ago, they're not ready for it. I mean, it's just I feel like they're not equipped for what is expected of them.
Yeah.
Great point. Great insight.
It's true. there's one more thing too. I think, you said you're an achiever. I think there are a lot of achievement-minded people in ministry. And I think that's one of the biggest causes of ministry stress and burnout in existence is putting all of your eggs into the basket of success. And because the fact is we actually can't fully control that basket. And I led a 5-day ministers retreat for about 40 ministers a couple months ago. And what I was really trying to get across, like in 1 Corinthians, like Paul planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but only God makes it grow.
Right.
So there's a divine division of labor between what God calls us to do as his disciples and what God does. And so I think sometimes we've mixed that up. And we can tell we've mixed it up because if things haven't grown, we've blamed the humans involved. Like, oh, you weren't faithful enough. You didn't share your faith enough. You didn't do enough. You weren't radical enough. You didn't lead your people well enough. It comes down to some big error. But that's not what the Bible says. It says God makes things grow. God provides the increase. And so if the dopamine hit you get is from hitting some goal, you're rarely going to get that dopamine hit. You're not going to feel good about ministry a lot because those goals are those successes are few and far between. If the enjoyment you get from ministry is from the process of doing ministry, you're already succeeding if you're doing the process. And you can actually enjoy your life as minister because you have done your duty by planting and watering. even if the growth doesn't happen. There's so many factors that can go into growth, into a church growing or not. So part of my role I see is to try to relieve ministers of that burden, because I actually think it's a humanistic burden we put on them.
Right. Well, that's really interesting, and I think that's one of the reasons why I contacted you after the conference, and we've set up a couple counseling sessions, and they've been really good, been very helpful. I mean, even you're saying those last few things, it's really challenging what you're saying there, because you read stories like the parable of the 10 minas, the guy who comes back and he multiplies what God gives him. And I think that's justified in the scriptures. There's a desire in my heart. I want to take all the talents God's given me. I want to bring it back to him. Right. And I feel like there's a good motivation. Jesus died for me. I don't want to be lazy. I want to work hard. I want to save souls. This world is lost. But I hear what you're saying, because it is true. It's more challenging than ever to try to see the results we saw, let's say 30 or 40 years ago. Yeah. So that puts pressure on me, and I know it puts pressure on other people. And totally. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think there's actually a hand-in-glove relationship between ministry stress and spiritual trauma. So, yeah. Well,
I going along with this, I found the most challenging section for me to be on page 272 and 273. I highlighted the whole thing. It says, you talk about how following the Spirit means surrendering outcomes. And I double underline that. I'm like, oh my gosh. Okay, you just nailed me right. I mean, there's other things and you're talking to people you identify as sloggers. What do you mean by that? You've already talked a little bit about it, but can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I call them sloggers. I have an affinity for them. I'm a recovering slogger myself. We all know who these people are. They're like the 20% of the church that do like 80% of the work. You know, they work full-time jobs. They're on top of their full-time job, and they work in responsible positions in their, in their day job. But then after work, they spend like 20, 30 hours a week serving the church. Like, they're tireless.
Right.
They are Marthas in a lot of ways. They're the ones who need to hear that message.
Yeah.
Of like setting down their burdens. And I would argue that we need to get to the heart of why are they gutting it out day in, day out? And I would wager that most of them would rather die a horrible martyr's death than be found to be worthless in the eyes of God. They're just so afraid of not measuring up. And it's tragic, because is that what God wants? Like, at the end of the day, does God actually want you to feel that way? Or is your life on earth a gift from God that he wants you to savor and enjoy along the way? Like, what's heaven? I mean, heaven is going to be just like here in some ways. Like, if we can't savor our walk with God in real time, that, like, right now, how are we going to do it in heaven when we're doing it for an eternity? So I invite people to take a step back and ask themselves, like, why are they leaving it on the field like this? Are they really like giving this loving gift to God, or is there something else driving them? Because it really matters. The why matters.
Yeah.
It's sort of like in a marriage, like, if somebody puts a gun to your head and says, "Tell me you love me," you're going to say, "I love you." You will, because you fear for your life. Does it mean you love them? Well, no. There's almost no correlation there. It's because it's being compelled from you. Of course, God doesn't want to put a gun to our heads. He wants us just to love him. And so I think Satan's actually the one holding the gun most of the time. He wants you to think that God's holding the gun. Because, again, he's a trickster, and he wants to mess you up. He wants to mess up your heart and your mind. And so if he can turn you into that older brother where you feel resentful because you've been leaving it all in the field and what are you getting in return, then he's got a chance of being able to take you out spiritually.
Right.
So there's a warning there.
Absolutely. I thought that, I mean, it was really good. It's like very revealing. And, it's like one of those things that my motto, hey, make this life count, live a no regrets life, multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. I stand by that. I go, I'm going to keep that until I die. But at the same time, I realize I have to have the right motivations. That's what calls me to like spend an hour in prayer, every day, and just get on my knees and just meditate and pray and think through the grace of God. Because I know there's that weakness in me to focus just on the achievement. And so I take the time I call it opening my treasure chest and think about the grace of God. And I think that's just so important. What troubles me is when people take sides and say, okay, I don't want to be like those woo-woo people that are just all into spiritual formation and have an extra on quiet times or whatever. Or if you want to make disciples, you're just works motivated. You're old school, curmudgeon or something like that. I just feel like it's divisive. It hurts the kingdom. I feel like the things that are being taught now about spiritual formation, Richard Foster covered 40 years ago in his book on celebration of the discipline. I feel like it's been there all along. Anyway, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the spiritual culture, because here's the dilemma that I find. You think about companies that make a huge difference: SpaceX, Tesla, Apple, Microsoft. I remember studying business in college in the 80s, and we read a book called, In Search of Excellence. And it talks about what makes great companies. And one of the main points in those books is there is a strong culture. There's like they didn't say cult-like, culture, but it's palpable. You can feel it. There's standards. And that's what the thing that drives the activity. There's usually a strong leader and then a strong culture along with it. And same thing happens in churches that are growing oftentimes, that there's a strong leader, there's a strong culture that follows in its wake. And when we abandon one thing, then all of a sudden it seems that the energy just dries up. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that dilemma, because, okay, let's say every person who has trauma gets healed. That'd be awesome. Mm-hmm. But will that really help us to win the world? And will those people all of a sudden go, okay, now I'm ready spiritually to go out and take on the world? I don't think so. I feel like, we're broken people. Even you say that in your book. You said, listen, if you haven't apologized in the last 6 months to someone in your church probably doesn't have much culture in it or a close family feel, which I thought that's so true. I go, it's that closeness that really attracted me. I thought, this church is awesome. They're fired up. They're doing stuff. They're connected. They're helping me. But when you kind of shuttle that, and just say, oh, that's bad. That's a conforming, that's a controlling culture. I go, you can get rid of it, but there's a cost. Mm-hmm. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because it's definitely something on my mind.
Yeah. Well, and certainly so many are mourning the loss of what we had. We remember those days, the so-called glory days, when it seemed like there were just constant Bible studies, people getting baptized all over the place. We were all young. And what's interesting is like this parallels our physical lives too, because like back then most of us were in our 20s and 30s, and now we're like in our 50s and 60s and 70s, and it's and so there's this parallel thing happening with all of us. It's not just the church as it's kind of exploded on the scene and developed. It's also our lives, and like our life course and the church course have run in parallel, which is fascinating. But I get it. Like it's hard when you look back and you realize that you're mourning the death of a dream.
Yeah.
And what we had was really special. And nobody can take that away from us. Like, we know what it was like. And the trouble, though, is that the good and the bad, they're hand in glove. Like, they can't be teased apart.
That's right.
And that's what makes it a mixed set of emotions. Because in hindsight, we look back and we go, okay, it was awesome, and we did some crazy stuff that we probably shouldn't have done.
Right.
There's this. Have you seen the movie Whiplash?
Yes.
So it's about this drummer. He wants to become like the best drummer, right? And he finds this mentor who uses these like really extreme methods. Like he throws like a cymbal at him at one point, and
right.
He's like really intense. And I remember watching the movie, and I started to have this feeling like, what does this remind me of? And then I realized, oh gosh, like I've had disciplers like this, And no, I would encourage anyone who's been in the church for any length of time to watch this movie, because it's so instructive for us. Because what happens at the end, this kid, he does become the most amazing drummer.
Exactly.
He gets pushed beyond his limits in every good and bad way that means.
Right.
So he does something awesome and awful at the same time.
Yeah.
And so that the question that the movie asks, sort of metaphorically, is like, what price are we willing to pay to achieve this thing, and is the cost worth it in the end?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great analogy, because the character, I think his name's J.K. Simmons or something like that, and he's really working on the kid. He's discipling the kid.
That's right.
But he's just diabolical about it. I mean, he just sets the kid up for failure and just embarrasses him in front of people, and yet he becomes like the next Buddy Guy or Buddy Rich, the next awesome drummer. Great point. Okay. Kind of wrapping up here. If a person's dealing with trauma and they need help, and they just feel like, they got things going on in their mind, they just need some help. Give me 3 bullet points. What 3 steps should they take? Where do they go? Who do they talk to? What should they do?
Yeah. I think the first thing they should do is assess whether or not they're safe, like they're physically safe. Like, are they in a situation that's safe for them? And because if they're not, they need to reach out and get help right away. Like if they're in a physically abusive or like a sexually abusive situation, gosh, they need to reach out. They need to say something. And churches just need to believe them. They just need to listen to them and respond as best they can. The second thing, and I mean, and I would say that like that's probably a small percentage of people.
Right.
I'd say for like your everyday member who suspects they've been wounded, the best thing they can do, it's going to sound weird, is start having quiet times. But I don't mean like the old school checkboxy quiet times. I mean, start having times alone with God where you're bearing your soul. God is safe in the sense of like, he's got your back. You are supremely safe in God. But the problem is we deny, we put ourselves into denial around painful things. So we need to give ourselves the time and space to really go there, think about what's happened, pray about it, meditate about it. That's how God's going to help us to work through some of this stuff.
So kind of lean into it, like face it. Don't stop avoiding it or downplaying it.
That's right.
Really let it out of the box, so to speak.
Yes. And what that means is actually going into your day timer and blocking off a day or like a half day. Because of course we're going to let the busyness of life distract us because we want to be distracted because it's so painful.
Yeah.
You may find that you need some extra help. And so I would say go to people who you trust in your fellowship, people who are known to be spiritual, who will honor your need for confidentiality, and who won't just advice give, but they'll listen to you. That's one thing. But you may also need some sort of counseling. I'd say be very careful about the counselor you choose. I don't think all counselors are created equal. There are, what the number one thing that people tell me they hear from their counselor when they go see them for church trauma? Why don't you just leave your church? Just leave the church. That's the number one piece of advice they get. And they're like, but you don't get it. You don't get me.
Right. Right.
And so you need to have either someone in our family of churches who gets it, and there are a lot of therapists in our family of churches, or find just a really good counselor. I had a counselor who was a Buddhist maybe 15 years ago. She was amazing. And at one point, I remember saying something to her, and she said, Sean, how do you think God feels about you talking about yourself in that way? And I'm like, oh, you got me. Like, you know, now I know she doesn't believe in Jesus, but she knew that I did and could work within my belief system and respect my belief system. So
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So.
That was one of the reasons why I gave you a call after the conference. Is you're an easy person to talk to, and you're friendly, and you've got, I don't know, it did remind me of Andy Overand in terms of just the friendliness and the affability. It's really great. And, in reading your book, I had some moments where I just like, oh, okay. I was kind of transported back in time to some things I'd kind of put away in the closet, and I pulled them back out, and I was like, wow. I remember times when I just felt physically upset, because of some things that had happened to me or I was involved in. And it's like, man, haven't thought about that in a long time. But it's a complex issue, and it really does help to talk to people. And I appreciate your approach, because what I feel coming out of your book is you love the church, you love our family of churches, you love the history. At the same time, you're not afraid to realize, hey, with any human organization, there's going to be problems and mistakes, whether it's a company or a church. I mean, any social organization, it's not isolated. I love what you said. You said to people who are thinking about leaving church, going somewhere else, you said, choose your dysfunction.
That's right.
Maybe in closing, you can just talk a little bit about that, because I thought that was a great point.
Yeah. Sinner's going to sin. It's just true. We're going to sin. Yeah. And man, a lot of us have mourned the loss of like our one true church theology. Like some of us truly believe we were the one true church, like us alone, like our family of churches, we were it. And that is a loss to realize, oh, maybe we're not. But there's a good side to that. We're also not like the most evil organization in the world, that the world has ever seen. Like the kinds of dysfunctions that we see in our family of churches, they're in every church family. They just look a little different. Right. And so we're not so bad that we're irredeemable. We've got some really great qualities, and wherever you go, the grass is always greener, right? So there's almost always a honeymoon period where you're like, wow, like I got to go to this church and it was amazing, and the preaching was incredible, and they had a latte bar in the foyer, and like they're translating into 8 languages every week, and like it's easy to have that honeymoon period, and then you dig in and you realize, oh wow, like their convictions are way different,
Exactly.
So
great point.
Yeah.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it, and all the best to you in this book. I hope it sells millions of copies. I just think it's very, very, very helpful and good. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate your time.
And thanks for listening. Here's how you can help support the program. First of all, hit the subscribe button and let your friends know about it. Also, read and review one of my books, either How to Plant and Grow a Church or Courage, How to Make This Life Count. You can find those on Amazon.com. If you'd like to reach out to Sean, I'll leave his information in the show notes. I'll leave his email and contact information, because my goal is to inspire you to make this life count, live a no-regrets life, and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. Have a great day, and make this life count.